Chris Biderman of the Sacramento Bee. First of all, how you doing, Chris?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
I'm good, man. I'm good.
Sounding good.
Yeah, always good to hear from my main man, Chris Biderman. So, Chris, maybe you can help me out with this because I just got done talking about how Niners had a bad day in the joint practices. Not really worried. If they blow the doors off the Raiders in the preseason, I'm not going to be jumping for joy. It's all whatever. One of the things that I don't understand is how people view Kyle Shanahan. And our guy, Scott Gobranson, he mentioned a quote. There's actually one of two quotes that seemed to just go all over the place about Kyle Shanahan yesterday. And one of them was the Jimmy Garoppolo quote. And I got it right here. I want to read it for the people because this was a firestorm. So they asked him about Jimmy Garoppolo. And he said, quote, "I think Jimmy was unbelievable for us. We won lots of games. Jimmy was unbelievable here. I think he was the best quarterback here in about 20 years since Steve Young. Had an unbelievable record, and every time he played and stayed healthy, we were either in the Super Bowl or NFC Championship game. I hope no one insinuates I've ever said differently," end quote. People were calling cap. People were upset with Kyle Shanahan. I didn't see anything wrong with what he said. What did you take from that quote, first of all, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kyle Shanahan very much knows that when he says something like that publicly, that has to sound a certain way versus what he might say privately, right? Like, we all know that Kyle Shanahan did basically everything he could to replace Jimmy Garoppolo. And I think to your point, or to his point, it was about a lot of that had to do with availability and the fact that Jimmy Garoppolo was hurt as often as he was. But I do think there's a feeling of, well, we might need to upgrade this position as well, because if you look at what happened in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl and the NFC Championship game against the Rams, there were instances where you could say, man, a couple throws here and there, and the 49ers might be lifting a trophy instead of going home. So when I see Kyle Shanahan say stuff like that, I believe him for sure. And I mean, it's certainly debatable on whether or not he was the best quarterback the 49ers have had since Steve Young. But I think, I take his word for it in that, like, Jimmy Garoppolo was very well liked in the building. Like, there was never a question about, whether or not Jimmy Garoppolo was a good teammate or a hard worker in the eyes of Kyle Shanahan, right? It was mostly about just the availability and, like, maybe we could upgrade this spot instead of, going into the playoffs with a top 12 quarterback. Maybe we could get somebody who's, could potentially be in that top 5 conversation from a talent perspective, because to win a championship, you're going to have to beat Patrick Mahomes and, Josh Allen and Justin Herbert and whoever else. So I think, Kyle Shanahan, what that was a product of was Kyle Shanahan being pretty dismissive of the idea of Jimmy Garoppolo coming back, and during the exit interviews last season, when he was like, I don't, he was kind of cold about it. Like, I don't see any scenario in which Jimmy's coming back. And it was cold in the sense that, like, man, Jimmy's given the team a lot, and it's kind of crazy to, like, not even leave the door open a little bit or not say what he said in that press conference yesterday in that moment. So it sort of seemed like it was a little bit cold, but I think Kyle Shanahan sometimes gets so wrapped up in ball that when he's talking, he doesn't, like, the emotional side of what he says can sometimes be on the back burner. And sometimes that comes out through press conferences. But I think ultimately Kyle Shanahan has a very high view of Jimmy Garoppolo, and ultimately, the 49ers decided to move on. Jimmy moved on, and that's kind of how things go. It's part of the business in the NFL.
And it's real quick, James. It's one of those things where, like, I understand it. I don't see anything wrong with it. Because people were like, "Oh, you tried to," and we'll talk to Kyle Matson. He's one of the guys that mentioned this too. You try to do everything you can to get him out the building, and you traded all these draft picks, and like almost like as if what Kyle was saying yesterday is contradicting his actions. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. We talk about this when Neemias Queta. I like Neemias Queta. I don't trust his ability to either stay healthy or produce the way I need him to. I think he's a good ball player. And in this
Right.
situation with Jimmy Garoppolo, he could like Jimmy Garoppolo. He could think Jimmy Garoppolo is good enough. He didn't trust his ability to stay healthy. And at that position, he felt like he couldn't move forward with Jimmy Garoppolo as the quarterback. Then you got other things as well when you talk about contracts and the production that Jimmy gives, and he's making $25-26 million. So, well, we gotta cut some salary somewhere to sign Debo, to sign Fred Warner, to sign Nick Bosa. We got to do it at the quarterback position. So we start over with a guy on a rookie contract. Just because he got rid of him or looked to get rid of him or anything else like that doesn't mean he didn't have respect for Jimmy Garoppolo, what he accomplished in San Francisco, and his ability when he was able to stay healthy.
Yeah, and Jimmy kind of went through a lot, right? Like Jimmy went from being on the trade block to, all right, well, I'm gonna technically be on the team and throw on a side field and keep loose and be in shape for my next stop. And then the 49ers are like, wait, we might as well just have Jimmy as a backup. Like, why not? and and there's this whole back and forth of the 49ers trying really hard to replace Jimmy, and Jimmy still being sort of a model citizen and a good teammate through it all. And there wasn't really any payoff for Jimmy, right? Like he didn't really get like he left kind of unceremoniously, and
Mm.
he didn't get like he didn't, he was hurt when the 49ers when the 49ers season ended, and he didn't really get to play or like have that moment, that cathartic moment with his team, like, man, this was it. Like it
Mm.
sort of felt like we had at the end of the 2021 season, in the NFC Championship game in LA. There was that moment where Jimmy was talking to the media and being like, "This might be it," right?
Right.
So there wasn't really that moment for everything Jimmy Garoppolo gave the 49ers in all these very unusual circumstances. There wasn't the payoff at the end. And so I think that's sort of why this is a little bit weird, from both Kyle Shanahan and Jimmy Garoppolo's standpoint. But now both sides have moved on, and the 49ers, think they can win a Super Bowl, the status quo, and the Raiders seem happy with Jimmy Garoppolo in the building. So it's just how it goes. It's life in the NFL. Sometimes divorces don't always end amicably, or with everybody smiling and happy and all of that stuff, but it's just how it goes.
It also, Chris, it feels like there was something you had to say at one point in time to make sure that everyone knew it was over. And
Yeah.
then after you say that, you can come back and reflect differently. You can
Mhm.
think differently at a different
Mhm.
time, and you can
Mhm.
really put things in perspective about what someone meant to a franchise, looking back. But what they mean to you at that moment, like he had to make a hard cut and say, like, we're done. This is over. We're not doing this anymore. We're not having someone draw pictures of him every single day and put them on Twitter. We're not doing any of that. It's over. It's done with, and we're moving on. And then you can come back later and be appreciative of the time you had together, as like a quarterback head coach tandem. So I just think that at this point are the Niners in a comfortable spot where they feel like they know how they're moving forward, because the Jimmy Garoppolo era is clearly over. Is the Brock Purdy era upon us? Or is it we think the Brock Purdy era is upon us and we're not sure? And again, we're dealing with injuries and coming back and all that stuff. But are they that confident in who and what he is moving forward?
I think they're confident in what they saw last year being a good sign of what could come from him and his development as a quarterback. I think one of the misconceptions that might be out there, and one of the reasons why the 49ers quarterback situation seems to be so polarizing among fans, is that just because Brock Purdy is clearly the starter right now doesn't mean that Kyle Shanahan views him as a starter for the next 10 years, right? Kyle Shanahan, of anybody, or knows as well as anybody, that things can change on a dime, right? Like Brock Purdy could get hurt again, and then all of a sudden it's Trey Lance's job or Sam Darnold's job. And maybe one of those guys ends up playing really well and goes on a deep playoff run. And then the situation is completely flipped, like it was, in December last year when Brock Purdy came in from basically starting the year out as a third string quarterback to becoming the starter and sort of the unquestioned starter going into this year. Kyle Shanahan, and this is very cliche, but this is how like hardcore football guys think. Kyle Shanahan's trying to win week 1. And so in his mind, it's like, all right, who gives us the best chance to win week 1? I'm going to go with the guy who we averaged 33 points a game with, who went undefeated in all the games he started and finished, right, at last year. And the 49ers believe they would have beat the Philadelphia Eagles had they had Brock Purdy available for that whole game. And who knows what would have happened in the Super Bowl, right? So Kyle Shanahan's operating from the standpoint of week 1, this is the guy that I think gives us the best chance to win. It's not by making Brock Purdy the starter. I don't believe Kyle Shanahan's looking at it like this is ironclad. This is our guy for the next decade plus. It's how we're winning week 1, and then we'll go week to week after that, because there's a very real possibility that something changes and there's an injury, and then Trey Lance or Sam Darnold gets thrown into the mix. And depending on how they play, maybe the quarterback situation looks completely different, the next spring. So I think the idea that Brock Purdy is a starting quarterback is very much like a week to week thing. And as he continues to stack good games, and his positioning sort of solidifies. But, the 49ers gave Jimmy Garoppolo $128 million contract, I think it was, thinking he would be the guy. And then ultimately they had to pivot, right? So Kyle Shanahan has started 3+ quarterbacks in 4 of his 6 seasons, right, with the 49ers. So he understands that things happen, that things change. And they've basically gone now through 3 different, quote unquote franchise quarterbacks. And he has to know, or he should know, that this could change on a dime. So they're going into the season saying Brock Purdy's a guy we think can help us win week 1 at Pittsburgh. And then from there, they'll sort of see how it goes. But I think they have a lot of confidence in what Brock Purdy did on film last year, which is why they're so confident in him, despite coming off the elbow injury and despite missing all of the offseason program because of the surgery. So, and that's not to say that Trey Lance isn't improved, right? Everything I've heard, I'm sure you guys have heard as well, is that Trey Lance looks better than he did last year when he was going into the season as the unquestioned starting quarterback. So, based on what we've seen from the 49ers quarterback situation, I don't think it should surprise anybody if at some point we're looking at Trey Lance and or Sam Darnold starting games and be like, wow, maybe the 49ers can go on a deep run with this guy also, because of who Kyle Shanahan is as a play caller and offensive designer, because of the amount of talent they have at their skill positions on offense, and because of how good their defense is. I think the 49ers can win a lot of games with any of those 3 quarterbacks they have. So I think Kyle Shanahan believes that too. And the reason why they do have 3 is because of all the injuries they've dealt with at quarterback. And they're sort of scarred by that. And going forward, like, we're going to need as many as possible, because we can't, our roster's so good. Our championship window isn't going to be open forever. We can't have it wasted if another quarterback gets hurt. So that's why they have 3 guys.
Oh, man, Chris Biderman of the Sacramento Bee, talking a little 49ers here with us today on D-Lo and KC. And I want to talk a little bit more about the backup, quote unquote, backup quarterbacks, Trey Lance and Sam Darnold. There's been a lot of talk all over the place about Sam Darnold possibly being QB2, Trey Lance possibly being moved in a trade or anything like that. Chris, I think it's ridiculous. Personally, there's not much of anything that could happen. Sure, anything could happen to change my mind, I guess, but I can't foresee it where I wouldn't have Trey Lance as QB2 going into the season, let alone like on the roster. Like, people are like, yeah, he's going to get traded at the end of camp. I don't know why you would do that. I don't understand that. What do you make of the whole situation with Sam Darnold, Trey Lance, his future with this team, his immediate future with this team? Where do you see that playing out?
Yeah, look, everything I've heard is that the backup quarterback competition is close, and maybe Trey Lance has the edge right now because he's the incumbent on the roster and knows the offense a little bit better. And I guess, that you could make an argument about who's been better at training camp. I think the 49ers are still intrigued by Trey Lance's ceiling and what that could look like. Like, Trey Lance's ceiling would appear to be much higher than Sam Darnold, and Sam Darnold's a guy who's checking down a lot, who's not being as aggressive on the practice field. And we'll see how that plays in the preseason. But look, if you listen to everything that is said by the power brokers with the 49ers and just look at the subtext of it, it's essentially that they're all in on this season. And so to my point earlier about needing three quarterbacks and having played three quarterbacks in four of Kyle Shanahan's 6 seasons, trading Trey Lance for a draft pick does not help them at all this year. Like all their chips are in on this season because there's a real good possibility that the roster is going to look pretty different going forward because you do have Nick Bosa's money coming. You do have Brandon Ayuk's money potentially coming, right? Like so you're not going to live in a world where you can just keep paying all your players and keep bringing in guys like Javon Hargrave. It's the credit card bills are going to come due at some point. And so, that's why they're all in on this season, because this is a very unique group of talented players based on just the financial ramifications of it, right? Like the 49ers are in the red next year. I think they're 10 million over the cap for next year before even Nick Bosa gets paid, right? So this is very much a win now scenario. So my pushback on the idea of, they're going to trade Trey Lance, if they trade Trey Lance for a draft pick next April, that does nothing for them this year, because as we've said, there's a reasonable chance that depending on whether he's the second string or even the third string quarterback, that Trey Lance is going to get meaningful snaps this year. And so that obviously that's way more important to this 49ers team than a draft pick in the spring. And so that's where my pushback would be, is that, this team needs its quarterbacks this year. And that's more valuable to them than a draft pick. And what they could do, if Brock Purdy starts every single game and plays really well and is a Pro Bowler and is somebody that they decide, hey, this is a guy we're building around, then they could trade Trey Lance in the offseason and then get that draft pick while still having him available all year this year. So it doesn't make any sense to me for them to trade Trey Lance right now. And maybe that's, in my opinion, the only way they trade Trey Lance is if somebody overpays. And the thing is with Trey Lance, his value, you would think, is the lowest it would be, right? As somebody coming off injury who hasn't put a ton of great stuff on tape, why would you trade him when his value's at its lowest point? Whereas if he were to start 3 or 4 games next year, if Brock Purdy turns an ankle, knock on wood, and Trey Lance has to start and Trey Lance looks good, then all of a sudden you're talking about, wow, maybe this guy does have value, and maybe you could get a day 2 draft pick for him for a team that really needs a quarterback that wants somebody a little bit more seasoned than whoever would be coming out. Or if, whatever team can't get Caleb Williams or one of the top guys in next year's draft. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to trade Trey Lance now. It would make plenty of sense to trade Trey Lance in the offseason because, you're probably not going to want to pay your backup quarterback $10 million next year. Like that's really the big part of this is if Trey Lance is the backup and Brock Purdy's the guy, the presumptive starter going into next season, then you're probably going to want to get cheaper at that position, given all of the money that you have to pay elsewhere. So that's when it makes sense to trade Trey Lance, is in the offseason, because you need him this year and because having him on your roster this year actually helps this year's team, whereas trading him for a draft pick doesn't help this team try to win the Super Bowl this year.
Chris, the Niners had Ray McLeod get injured this week, and that's a big deal for them. I mean, he's a pretty solid, kick returner, punt returner. How are they going to replace him? How are they going to fill that void? Especially, I mean, it looks like broken wrist, out 8 weeks. It's early, so he's not going to miss that much of the season, but still, it is an important position on this team.
Yeah, they had Brandon Ayuk. You remember a couple years ago, return punts. He wasn't great at it. He certainly wasn't bad at it. I think they trust his hands, but obviously, Brandon Ayuk, I think, might push back on the idea of being the primary punt returner, given he's going into what's essentially a contract year, and doesn't want to get hurt in that phase. So yeah, you're looking at Ronnie Bell, a 7th round pick from Michigan, who returned a lot of punts at Michigan. I don't know that he was necessarily great at it, but he certainly has experience doing it. And Deshaun Jameson, a backup, undrafted rookie backup cornerback, is somebody who the team has talked about a little bit in glowing terms in terms of the way he's playing. And I think I haven't looked. I've been meaning to look, but I think the 49ers have had an undrafted rookie make the team. I think every year since Kyle Shanahan has been head coach. And I think Deshaun Jameson might be the guy this year who would be the undrafted guy to make the team, because you look around, I mean, there aren't a whole lot of position battles, it would seem, at least right now, when, August 11th, at the back end of the roster that seem to be available. This is a very veteran team, a very established team. But if you're going into the season knowing that you're probably going to have Ray McCloud on IR for the first month or so, then you're looking at needing a returner, and Deshaun Jameson, a backup corner, can also do that too. So between him and Ronnie Bell, that'll be interesting. And I think on offense, I don't know, how much they would necessarily miss Ray McCloud. I know he's made some splash plays for them, but barring injury, like with Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk and Juwan Jennings and potentially Danny Gray, right? Danny Gray is somebody who it's going to be a big year for him, former 3rd-round pick going into his second season. It'll give him potentially an opportunity at more snaps. So it's certainly Ray McCloud is certainly a notable loss in the return game. But I think the 49ers have the numbers on offense that they wouldn't really feel that absence all that much.
Yeah. Real quick before we get you out of here, Chris, we got about a minute. Any update on Nick Bosa? Like, is it still just mom is the word for everybody?
You guys,
the same thing.
Yeah, you guys know as much as I do. I will say, you can go back to 2016 when Joey Bosa had his holdout, and that's when, he was a rookie, and it was there was all these, specific things in the contract that caused the disagreement and caused his holdout when, basically the salary was sort of predetermined. I would imagine the parameters of the contract and what the money looks like is something that the 49ers and Nick Bosa's camp can agree on. I would guess the reason why there's a holdup is there's a whole lot of specific stuff happening. So you remember, like, Trent Williams' contract was very complicated when he re-signed a couple years ago. That was essentially 2-3-year deals, and sort of like the back end of it was dependent on like cap spikes and all that and what the salary cap looks like in future years. Yeah. Given the 49ers salary cap situation, how complicated it is with all of the big salaries they have on the books, I would imagine they need to get really creative to make Nick Bosa the highest paid defensive player in the league. And when it comes to being creative, those complications can be more difficult to figure out. So that's where I think this is. I haven't heard anything different than that. You guys probably know as much as I do on this, but I think, we're probably a week or two from, before it gets like uncomfortable to where like, no, that they really need him there. I still think it's early enough in the process to where you don't mind if Nick Bosa is not there right now. But if we're having the same conversation in a couple weeks, then I think it starts to get a little worrisome.
All right. Yeah, I'm not there yet, but we want to get this done. It's time to start getting this done. All right. That's where I'm at, man. Chris, man, we always appreciate you pulling up on us, man, and talking a little 49er football. We didn't even get to talk about the disappointment of the Kings not being on Christmas or not, but we'll get to that.
I mean, you want to work on Christmas?
I wouldn't be working on Christmas.
Okay. Well, some of us would be working on Christmas, so
understandable.
Nope.
Understandable. I appreciate you again, Chris. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks for having me.